The feeling of prosperity and greatness that marked this period led authorities to develop diverse plans for leisure, creating excellent museums in the city. They were essentially conceived as a means of educating the working classes and celebrating the magnificence of the empire. The London Museum, one of the most popular, offers visitors a complete panorama of London's history. Amongst other exhibits, one can find there the social and technological evolution of the Victorian period, as well as the armchair in which Charles Dickens wrote A Tale of Two Cities. The Natural History Museum demonstrates the Victorian passion for this new opening on the world, driven by the rise in scientific thinking. Large public libraries were products of this intellectual effervescence, places where the public and researchers would henceforth have access to all British publications. St. Thomas Hospital is now home to the Florence Nightingale Museum and reminds us of this illustrious contemporary of Dickens who founded the first nursing school. During the Crimean War in 1855, Florence Nightingale started a revolution when she scoured battlefields to care for the wounded. Later, touched by Dickens' descriptions, she deployed her energy nursing poor people and bettering the sanitary conditions in the East End slums of London.
In the early years of last century, nurses had a very bad reputation. The worst nurses were not only unethical, they were criminal in their negligence of patients. And Charles Dickens was very concerned about social matters, and he highlighted the poor quality of nurses. In his book Martin Chuzzlewit, he characterized nurses as Sari Gamps, that was the character. And typically, Sari Gamp would go to the patient's bedroom, she would lock herself in for the night, she'd turn her back to the patient and start drinking. Nursing began to change during the Crimean War, when Florence Nightingale went with a group of nurses at the request of the War Department. And as a result of her heroic work there, money was raised to enable her to start a training school for nurses. And her first requirement was that the nurses entering the training school should be sober, honest, truthful, trustworthy, clean, neat, punctual, tidy. So Florence Nightingale started with the moral qualities, and then she taught them practical nursing, how to look after patients, how to prepare diets, how to administer medicines, how to make notes. And gradually, from the 1870s into the 1880s, nursing became one of the most popular professions. In fact, after school teachers, it was the only profession that was really available to women until almost the end of the 19th century.
I'll sing you a new ballad, and I'll warrant it first rate, of the days of that old gentleman.
In response to the unbridled growth and pollution in cities, the Victorian authorities also made decisions to create green spaces where people could breathe better and have a place for recreation. If the parks offered the illusion of contact with nature, they also offered the opportunity for different fresh air activities, the picnic perhaps being the most popular.
The doors were garnished well with gibbets, whips and chains, with fine old English penalties.
For Victorians, picnics were prepared in a manner that recalled a military expedition. With the exception of the kitchen sink, they brought along absolutely everything that they thought necessary and spread it about them on the lawn in the park. A picnic, worthy of the name, required carrying several baskets that contained a linen tablecloth and serviettes, silverware, crystal glasses, a tea service, and china cups. As for the menu, it was in accordance with the pomp of the place settings. There were several sorts of meat and many salads, accompanied by imported wines and beer. Generally, the expedition took all afternoon, when one served tea complete with sandwiches, jellies, and little cakes.
times, soon may they come again.
If the refined arrangements of the flower beds cheered passers-by, it also awoke their curiosity about botany. The splendid gardens of Kew Gardens drew crowds who were astonished by the exotic floral displays. This attraction for the botanical went hand in hand with Londoners' curiosity about their zoo. Opening in 1828, it was the first one of its type in the West. Queen Victoria didn't stop with the creation of excellent museums and parks. After the death of her husband, she invited the public to contribute to a fund that was used to erect the Royal Albert Hall. It was a prestigious concert hall built to commemorate the memory of Prince Albert. 1,300 seats were put on sale, guaranteeing their owners the right to attend all events free of charge for 999 years. This agreement is still respected today.
You might be interested to know that a Grand Tier box, which cost £1,000 in those days, now, when they come on the market, which is very rare, costs about £300,000.
While my contemporaries were distracting themselves and exclaiming at the wonders of the empire, I, Charles Dickens, continued to write in order to open their eyes to society's inequalities. After David Copperfield, I published back-to-back Bleak House, Hard Times, and Little Dorrit, where I attacked one by one the torpidity of the justice system, the inhuman behavior of industry chiefs, and the sadistic cruelty prevailing in Her Majesty's jails. In November 1850, the publication of the last episode of David Copperfield confirmed the literary mastery and maturity of its author. With time, David Copperfield became the best-known novel of Charles Dickens. 6 months later, the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations opened in London and marked the beginning of the golden age of Victoria's reign. If most of Dickens' fellow citizens felt a little smug about England's apparent supremacy in the worlds of business and invention, he detested the self-approving tone of the event. "1851 will be, like all the years that preceded it, a new year of crime, sickness, poverty, and ignorance. Why not organize a parallel event called the Great Exhibition of England's Errors and Negligence?" Charles Dickens was not the only one preoccupied by the negative consequences of capitalism on workers. That same year, attracted by the economic excitement and the social upsets brought about by the Industrial Revolution, the philosopher Karl Marx installed himself in London. Seated at the British Library in chair number G7, Karl Marx began to work on his masterwork, Das Kapital. Even if Victoria's reign was a period of intense intellectual effervescence, an apex of thought in the Western world, London continued to swell like an unhealthy wart. When a cholera epidemic hit the capital, killing 20,000 people, Dickens' paper published the most ferocious declaration he had ever written. "I would like you to feel, fellow Englishmen, a part of the disdain that I feel for the House of Commons and an incompetent government, and one I believe guilty in God's eyes of mass murder." He had never been so close to proposing a social revolution, and in his private conversations, Dickens openly expressed his wish to see the workers unite and chase from power those who misled and mistreated them. In 1867, Parliament bowed to strong pressure from the workers by adopting the Second Reform Bill, which recognized the right to form unions and extended the vote to all male workers in cities. Before the end of the century, all the social reforms demanded by the Chartists and Dickens, judged radical 20 years earlier, were in place. In March 1870, Charles Dickens was invited to Buckingham Palace by Queen Victoria, who wrote in her diary, "With his voice and agreeable manners, he appeared quite likable." June 9th, 1870, 3 months after this historic tete-a-tete, Charles Dickens died of a heart attack in his villa at Gad's Hill Place. He was 58 years old. His old friend, the American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, wrote to the family, "I've never seen the death of a writer evoke such sorrow. One can say without exaggeration that the whole country is plunged in grief." In his will, Dickens was careful to be precise. "I do not wish to be the subject of a monument, memorial, or testament. The only glorified titles that I wish left in the memory of my compatriots are my books." It was in the strictest privacy that Charles Dickens was buried in Westminster Abbey, where he rests in Poets' Corner between Shakespeare and Milton. The day after the funeral, the Daily News wrote, "Without any doubt, Charles Dickens was the novelist of his times. Thanks to his pictures of contemporary life, posterity will know better than through archives the true character of England in the 19th century." Queen Victoria outlived him by 31 years, during which time England continued to extend her colonial empire. In 1887, at the height of her economic and colonial power, England celebrated Victoria's Golden Jubilee with grand festivities. 1 year later, Jack the Ripper terrified all London during his autumnal killing spree. Although Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't succeed in solving this series of grisly murders, his hero, Sherlock Holmes, would have. Holmes was a direct literary descendant of Dickens' Mr. Pickwick, literature's first private detective. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, she had reigned for 64 years, the longest and most prosperous period in the Kingdom of England. The need to supply itself with raw materials and the desire to sell its manufactured products had pushed Britain to extend its influence and enterprise over 1/4 of the lands on the planet, thus creating the empire on whom the sun never set. If Charles Dickens only wrote about the sordid profile of London, a large part of this influential capital that we know today was created by the Victorians themselves. The police force, the underground subway, the major museums, the first zoo, the parks and botanical gardens, street lighting and public transportation represent only the most visible part of the legacy left to us by Dickens' contemporaries. By being the first to demand reforms that are today part of our daily lives, the Victorians made an enormous contribution by valuing humanity in the modern world they were creating. They left their 20th century inheritors the difficult task of answering the economic, scientific, environmental, and social problems that they identified so well. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way.